they would start stepping on each other's toes, and they would go to war with each other. And he was trying essentially to explain World War I, where Germany, which as generally considered to be the nation that instigated the war, was a country that was very, very dissatisfied with the fact that it had such a small share relative to countries like England, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Belgium, had such a small share of the colonial domain, and that was one of Germany's beefs. Not its only beef, but one of them just before World War II. So anyway, that is that is all you have to know about the Marxist theory. But it's worth knowing these things just because, you know, it was wrong. Obviously it was wrong. Virtually none of which had been predicted by Marx actually came to pass. But it was so influential in shaping history, and so many people believed it for so long, that it is worth knowing something about it, and worth knowing where all this thinking came from and what assumptions it was based upon. Okay, when I review the major terrorist groups again, happy to do so. The terrorist group of which we hear the most, of course, is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist group which was founded by a fellow called Osama bin Laden, who was bumped off last year by Navy Team 6, hiding out in Pakistan. But it was an organization founded by him, which was initially headquartered in Afghanistan while the Taliban ruled it, and before 9/11, before we intervened to remove the Taliban, it was housed essentially in Afghanistan. And the purpose of Al-Qaeda, remember Osama bin Laden was a Saudi Arabian citizen of Yemeni extraction who was revolted by the fact that the West, the Christian West, had established such a presence in the Middle East, and particularly by the fact that it had established a military presence, including a major air base in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the home to the two holiest sites in Islam, which is Mecca and Medina. Mecca, the place where the Prophet Muhammad was born. Medina, the place where in the 7th century he prophesied and applied his trade. And it was considered unconscionable from the point of view of fundamentalist true believer such as Osama bin Laden that this godless West should be allowed to have to leave its military footprints on the land of Mecca and Medina. And so he was furious about that. And one of the goals of Al-Qaeda has been to expel the West from the Middle East. Another goal of Al-Qaeda has been to eliminate Israel from the Middle East. Again, if you are Osama bin Laden, you regard that part of the world as the inalienable religious bequest of all Islam, and to have a Jewish state there is regarded as anathema to people like Osama bin Laden. So the getting rid of Israel was one of his goals. And finally, what he would have liked to have done was to unite all Islamic countries of the world, all Islamic societies, into one big Islamic federation, presumably, since he is from the Sunni branch of Islam and not the Shiite branch of Islam, Sunni Islamic federation, and he has resorted to some of the most inventive forms of terrorism, including driving fuel-filled planes into major buildings such as the Twin Towers and have them blow up. It was very important to have those planes crash into a tall building, which they couldn't miss, and that was not terribly far from the airport from which they departed, because in this case both the airport and the buildings were in New York. because he wanted them to be full of fuel on impact, because then the fireball and the explosion and so forth will be far greater. So he's pioneered some novel approaches to terrorist destruction. He's considered to have been responsible for the bombing of the U.S. Diplomatic facilities in Tanzania and Kenya in 1998, and for a few other acts, such as acts against U.S. servicemen in Somalia in the late 1990s and so forth. Al-Qaeda has largely been ousted from Afghanistan by U.S. military efforts. It is headquartered now largely in neighboring Pakistan and in the frontier provinces of Pakistan that abut Afghanistan, that are very mountainous, and where the Pakistani government, where its authority does not extend, which it doesn't control to a large extent. There are several major branches of Al-Qaeda operating elsewhere in the world. One important branch is called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, and it is active, although not very numerous in membership. It is active in Saudi Arabia, and it is active in Yemen. And then there is another important branch called Al-Shabaab, which is active, it's an Al-Qaeda cell that is active in Somalia, Somalia being a country which for several decades now has had no effective government. So Al-Qaeda is obviously the terrorist organization that we fear the most. There are terrorist organizations that are associated with nationalist grievances and attempts at national self-determination, such as the Chechen terrorists in Chechnya, that province of Russia's, largely Islamic province of Russia's that wants independence. You have Basque terrorists who want to create a separate Basque homeland. The Basques are a minority in Spain. There are some Basques in French too. And then you have two major terrorist organizations in the Middle East, one of which we hear a lot of, which is Hamas. Hamas is an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. It is active, has always been active on the Gaza Strip, that little part of Egypt that was occupied by Israel in 1967, and which now has a Hamas-led government to it. Hamas is an organization that doesn't recognize the existence of the State of Israel, wants to get rid of it, and has also perfected, it does not direct its attacks against the West the way Al-Qaeda does just against Israel, but it has perfected the technique of suicide bombing, where you strap dynamite around your waist and go and blow yourself and everybody else up in some crowded venue. Another organization which we consider terrorist, although it hasn't done anything particularly terroristic in a while, is Hezbollah. Hezbollah is an organization that was set up at the time when Israel occupied Lebanon in the 80s to rid Lebanon of the Israeli occupation. And Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, is a Shia organization. Islam in Lebanon is largely Shia, not Sunni Islam. Both Hamas and Hezbollah are more than just militant, violent organizations. They're also organizations that are very much into governance, into welfare, into providing schools, hospitals, things of that sort on their territories. What else? The United Nations Conference on the Law of the Seas. The United Nations Conference on the Law of the Seas is something which we began negotiating in 1973, and which actually came into being in 1982. The United States is not a party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. Although it claims to abide by its provisions, it is not a party to it. And one thing that the U.S. objected to, these were the days of the Reagan administration and so forth, it objected to the fact that According to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, any minerals found on the seabed outside of the exclusive economic zones of countries would be owned internationally, and an international and UN-mandated body would be in charge of extracting and marketing those resources. And the regular administrations thought, no, we don't want that because we're the only ones that have any hope of having the technology to do it anyway, so why should we share it with anybody else? And so we didn't sign the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. But the seabed minerals is a minor part of it. Most of it we agree with and we abide with. And there are two important provisions, in which I mentioned, talked about, especially when I talked about Arctic mineral wealth, and I talked about the South China Sea too. And that is that it sets the territorial waters of a nation state. And it used to be 3 miles from the coastline, according to the Law of the Seas Convention. It is now 12 miles from your shore, from the point at which land becomes sea. It's 12 miles out of there. And these 12 miles of water are considered part of your country. They are part of the country where your laws apply and where you can legislate anything. So that if a crime occurs on a boat 11 miles off your coastline, it's as if it happened in the center of your country. It is part of your territory, so you can decide who is allowed to come into your territorial waters and who is not allowed to come into your territorial waters. The way you would be able to decide who's allowed to come in onto your territory by granting them visas and those whom you do not allow. Remember, there is one exception to the fact of not allowing people into your territorial waters. What was that? No, not quite refugees.
Innocent passage?
Yes, international straits. In other words, if your territorial water is a thin body of water that links two big bodies of water, two seas or oceans, like the Bosphorus Strait in Turkey or the Northwest Passage in Canada, then you are supposed to allow innocent passage for the boats of all nations through it. And by innocent, it means as long as they can't be meaning you any harm or doing you any harm, which essentially excludes naval vessels. They have to have particular permission to traverse it. But generally, those 12 miles of your territorial waters are your country, your land. All your laws apply. Beyond that, the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas devised the concept of exclusive economic zone. And an exclusive economic zone extends 200 miles from your shore. But between the point of 12 miles and the point of 200 miles, which are the limits of your exclusive economic zone, your laws do not apply. This is not part of your sovereign territory. If a crime occurs 150 miles off your shores, your laws don't apply to it, even if it's in the exclusive economic zone. The laws of the country in which the ship is registered, as we pointed out when we discussed international law, would apply to it. You can't decide who's allowed to traverse your exclusive economic zone. If they are traveling 70 miles off your coastline, it's not your territorial waters anymore. The only right you have is right to exclusive economic exploitation of that 200-mile area, which means fisheries, unless you allow somebody else to come in and fish there, and any minerals or hydrocarbons found on the seabed. They are yours and yours alone. And then we said that one exception to the 200-mile rule is if your continental shelf, the shallow body of water, and I showed you the slide the other day with a drawing of a continental shelf. If your continental shelf, and they rarely do, but if a continental shelf extends more than 200 miles beyond your territorial waters, your exclusive economic zone will apply to the entire continental shelf. And mind you, with the exclusive economic zones, about 1/3 of the world's seas and oceans are part of somebody's exclusive economic zone, and about 2/3 are not. They are just international waters. And we explained last time the importance of little islands, even if they're just rocks in the middle of the ocean. If you can claim it as yours, then everything 200 miles around that is yours too. And which explains, I think, why there are sometimes these very bitter disputes over what seem like worthless little islands in the South China Sea or the East China Sea or places like that. It's not the islands themselves, it's the 200 miles that it gives you that are of such great value. What are the major international human rights conventions? Okay, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, while not binding, is considered a foundation for everything else. All members of the United Nations are party to the non-binding Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states many things which are in the part of American political history, namely that there can be no mistreatment of people on the basis of race, religion, or national origin. It dismisses torture as a tool of policy and so forth. But it is not a convention. It is supposed to inform future conventions, but it is not legally binding. The major legally binding ones are the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination in 1969, which theoretically binds all of the signatories to reject any form of discrimination based on race, religion, or national origin, but it doesn't talk about gender. So another convention was signed, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 1981, which applies these same principles to gender, outlawing various forms of gender discrimination. We said that the United States was not a party to that one. There's the Convention Against Torture in 1987, which takes the statement about torture from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and makes it law, at least for those who signed it. There is the Convention on the Rights of the Child that was signed in 1989 but entered into force in 1997, was it? Let's say it was 1997, and I am subject to correction if I am wrong, which eliminates various practices regarding children, such as child labor, the use of child soldiers in war, and things of that sort. Those are the major conventions. The UN-based and universal conventions. In addition, in Europe, you have a variety of somewhat more developed and advanced conventions that are part of the European Union system on human rights and so forth. So those are the questions I was asked to address. Is there anything more I can tell you that you absolutely have to know in order to get an A on the exam? Nothing? You know everything that is required for an A on the exam? Okay, that's it. Well, thank you very much. You've been a great class. It was a pleasure teaching you. Take care.